The 4 decades of rock on 106.1 Rock Radio. All this week, the 70s, prog, punk and power cuts. Today, the technology.
Let's talk about live music. Whenever I look in my Guinness Book of Records, it still tells me that the loudest gigs are from 30 or 40 years ago. The Who at the Isle of Wight, The Who at Wembley, Led Zeppelin at Nebworth, stuff like that. How had music gone from the Beatles not being able to hear themselves in 1964 for people not being able to hear anything for 3 or 4 days after seeing Led Zeppelin 10 years later? How does that happen?
I think it's partly bigger, but it's partly, in many cases, it's actually driven by the band. Like you said with the Beatles last week, they became incredibly frustrated with the fact that nobody could hear them when they played live, and that all the power they were creating on their records was just lost when they were playing through these terrible sound systems in big halls. And they were really the force that drove people to create these better PA systems that could really kind of pack a punch.
What about mixing sound live? When does that begin?
It's a slow growth. Right at the start of the 70s, if you went to see a band such as Led Zeppelin, perhaps, they would have a little mixing desk with 8 faders on that you could say, well, I want the vocals to be a little bit louder or the bass to be a little bit louder, not really offering a huge amount of control. And then slowly, in parallel with what's happening in studios, live sound mixes just get more and more complicated.
What about the LP? The 70s is really the decade of the long player, isn't it? Of things like double albums. And when did the LP really come along?
The LP was invented, I think, in the 50s, but it doesn't really become the dominant format for music sales until the late 60s, and there's a point in the 60s at which it overtakes the single as the means by which the record industry makes its money.
Why is that, Sam? Because you'd think there was more money in a single. You only have to record 2 tracks, one for the A side, one for the B side.
You've still got the same cost of distribution, manufacture. They're not going to be great deals of difference between a single and an album. And again, it's many cases by the bands who want to use the album as a format to create what they see as a longer work of art.
You're watching a machine turn soft, hot plastic into cold, hard cash. Breaking records by making records. More than 4 million of them. It's the biggest single batch of new albums ever packaged in one day for worldwide distribution. That tops even the Beatles at their best, and everyone else who ever tried to turn a profit at 33 1/3 revolutions per minute. The place is a pressing plant in Los Angeles, center city of the rock music world. The group is Kiss, the label's Casablanca, and the ultimate payoff, a staggering $40 million. Pure platinum. But more than that, almost a sure thing going in, because Kiss, like a handful of other top groups, never sell less than 1 million albums. And because no matter who performs, today's incredible demand for rock always seems to outrun that available supply by a big money mile.
This is a decade when people put records on and sit in a chair listening to the music. It's not background noise, is it?
Exactly. And you get bands like Led Zeppelin, for instance, one of the biggest selling bands of all time, famously never released a single in the UK.
But magnetic tape was a genius invention, wasn't it?
Oh.
Didn't it go back to like the 20s or something like that?
I don't know if it was exactly when it was invented, but it was the Germans in World War II who turned it into a usable format.
And a reusable format, which of course was important.
And also an editable format, which is kind of the key, because prior to that, once you made a recording, you've made a recording. When you've got tape, you can chop it up into pieces and stick them back together again.
And the interesting thing is that technicians see recording equipment as a tool to record the music, but musicians like the Beatles, Frank Zappa and Pink Floyd actually started to use the recording equipment as instruments.
Very much so, yeah. Actually, one of the most interesting examples is 10cc and their best-known song, I'm Not in Love. If you listen to that song, one of the things that makes it really amazing is this sort of really spooky vocal chorus that goes on throughout.
Yeah.
And they created that in a really interesting way. They had a 24-track recorder, and they all sung, they used one track for each note, and they sung ah onto each of those tracks. And then when it came to actually making the record, they literally played that tape recorder as if it was an organ, and creating chords simply by pushing up faders on their desk.
I'm not in love, so don't